Good evening. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Great. Good evening. My name is Carrie Keller, and I serve as the Associate Provost here at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and it is my honor to welcome you all to this event tonight, the Rurally Responsive Education Conference. I will be quick, as I am not the main speaker, and you all want to hear other people rather than me. But one of the things that we take seriously here at University of Wisconsin-Platteville is the idea of being a steward of place. It's the idea that we have a responsibility to collaborate with community stakeholders in the places we are located to maximize shared opportunities and jointly address critical issues. Tonight is one of our opportunities to do that. And if we look around, we see that we have students, faculty, and alumni, but we also have people in the field of education and adjacent fields here, all to learn together. So thank you so much for this opportunity. My job this evening then is to introduce Dr. Alex Tack, who serves as the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. I would like to thank Dr. Doug Adams for submitting the grant and working with them to bring this speaker to our campus and to create this opportunity for us all to learn together, and really to the Tommy Thompson Center for creating these kinds of opportunities on our campus. It's really fruitful work, and we're grateful to have the opportunity. So Dr. Tack's background then is one in public leadership. He serves as an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research and teaching interests are near and dear to my heart. I'm a statistician as well, but he is in American politics and statistical methodology. Professor Tack completed his doctoral work in political science at Stanford, where he received a master's degree in statistics. He received his undergraduate degrees in math and political science from MIT. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Tack to the stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, thank you, and good evening. So I am Alex Tack. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and we're really delighted to be able to sponsor tonight's event and partner with UW-Platteville to make this possible. I want to thank our speaker, thank everyone here at UW-Platteville, as well as Ruth and Mary Kate at the Thompson Center for all your work to make tonight possible and putting this event together. And most of all, I want to thank everyone here working to address the challenges and needs in rural education, which attracts so much less attention than it deserves. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me just say a few brief words. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. We work to further these goals by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Lindsay Hollingsworth, Associate Professor of Education and Interim Director of the School of Education. Dr. Hollingsworth completed her undergraduate education at Luther College with a degree in elementary education. After graduation, she began her educational career teaching 3rd and 4th grade in Mesa, Arizona, and she continued her own education, receiving a master's degree from the University of Phoenix and a doctorate from Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. She joined the faculty of the School of Education in 2012. Lindsay is a licensed teacher in the state of Wisconsin with credentials as a reading teacher, teacher of English as a second language, and elementary middle level education. She is a member of the Wisconsin State Reading Association, the Wisconsin Rural School Alliance, the National Rural Education Association, and she also serves on the State Superintendent's Advisory Council on Rural Schools, Libraries, and Communities. So, please welcome Lindsay Hollingsworth.
Greetings, everyone, from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville School of Education. We have a rich history of training educators for more than 150 years. In fact, we were the state's first normal school, and that was established in the year 1866. The School of Education takes great pride in this long-standing tradition and is committed to providing quality educational programs. Recently, the School of Education adopted a place-based framework with a rural education focus. This approach is supported by data that indicates that 80% of our graduates go on to teach in rural communities in the Midwest and throughout the country. Place-based education is a learner-centered approach that connects classrooms to communities. By focusing on the strengths of our local schools, particularly in rural communities, we prepare teachers skilled at connecting classroom lessons to the world around them. In her book, Rural Education in America, What Works for Our Students, Teachers, and Community, our speaker tonight, Dr. Sky Marietta, eloquently shares a vision for rural schools that mirrors our work at UW-Platteville. She shares, we want rural educators to walk away with a more complex understanding of rural schools and which educational efforts work best. And, according to her, efforts that are place-based, responsive to current economic needs, and promote collaboration beyond the school walls have the greatest chance of succeeding. It is exciting to be in this room tonight with a group of community members committed to this vision. We are also excited to host our very first Rural Education Conference tonight and are incredibly grateful for the Thompson Center support. Great events like this take a lot of time and planning, and I would like to invite the conference planning team to stand and be recognized at this time. Carrie Van Halgren, who's in the back of the room. Thank you. Jolene Werlein, Jessica, thank you. Jessica Brogley, who had to step out for a school board meeting. Adina Haslauer. Jenny McLean, seated right here. And Doug Adams. Thank you all for your efforts to make tonight possible. And at this time, I would like to welcome my colleague and friend to the stage, Dr. Doug Adams. Dr. Adams is an assistant professor in the School of Education. He has a PhD in human geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he completed his teacher training at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. He's passionate about fostering inclusive spaces in rural areas, and his co-authored piece, Living Act 31, Perceptions from Bayfield, Wisconsin, is forthcoming this year and will appear in the Journal of American Education and the Rural Educator's special issue, Recentering Intellectual, Cultural, and Political Sovereignties, Indigenous Education in Rural Spaces. Please welcome Doug.
Hello, y'all. I'm Doug Adams. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sky Marietta tonight. Sky Marietta is an Appalachian author, early childhood advocate, and businesswoman. She's also the owner of Moonbow, a group of small businesses that provide unique local food and retail in previously vacant historic buildings on Main Street in Corbin, Harlan, and Williamsburg. Marietta grew up in Kentucky, the fifth of her parents of 7 children. She went on to college at Yale, became a teacher on the Navajo Nation, and then went on to receive her doctorate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in childhood development with a focus on language and literacy. Rural communities have been a through line in her work, including her dissertation that examined the differences between early literacy development in urban and rural communities. She has co-written 3 books, including Rural Education in America, Teaching Advanced Literacy Skills, and Making Assessment Matter. She lives with her husband, Jeff, and sons Harlan and Perry, and their dog, Ro. After Dr. Marietta's remarks, she will join me for a dialogue. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Sky Marietta.
Well, hello there. Let me make sure I'm kind of short. So let's see, can you all hear me okay? I am so excited to be here today, and I really appreciate the hospitality here in Platteville from the School of Education. It's been such a pleasure to get to hang out with people today, for the warm welcome with the faculty and the staff and the students. So grateful for the Thompson Center for sponsoring this great event. I was explaining these kind of in-person events have, in my opinion, gotten kind of rare. So it's very exciting to get to travel here. I've been in Wisconsin many times, but this is my first time here. I was telling people, my husband is from northern Minnesota, and we wrote this book together, and he was a little jealous that I got invited and he didn't. But I told him they don't need somebody from Minnesota here talking about how maybe the Vikings will have a great year this year, and oh, you think that's cold, you know, that kind of stuff. So I was really excited that I got to be the one to come today. And I'm going to share a little bit about a little bit from the book and a little bit about why we think rural America is like investing in Amazon in the 1990s, that this is a wonderful place to be. And we think the word is going to get out and catch on. So just really thinking about the tremendous impact that our schools especially can have on our rural communities, and really trying to look forward in a really honestly hopeful and optimistic way that comes from a place of reality in our current context. So let's see if I can make these slides work. What do I do? Uh-oh, technical difficulties. I'm hitting the forward button. Uh-oh, I see somebody's gonna come and run to my rescue. So while we're getting the clicker fixed, I should have checked this before, I'll go ahead and start sharing a little bit more about my background. That was a great introduction from Dr. Adams, I appreciate it. But I grew up in rural Appalachia. So if you think about coal mining communities in the mountains, banjos, whatever kind of ideas you might have about that, that is where I'm from, and I'm from a big family. All right, there we go. So what do? I hit this? All right, thank you so much. So there you can see, hearing I'm number 5 of 7 children is sometimes different from seeing a picture of how big of a family. Those are 2 of my nieces are in there. And I qualified for free lunch every year that I went to school. I grew up poor. And the interesting thing about it is I didn't really know that until I went to college. So I was a very ambitious kid, and I thought success meant leaving Kentucky and never looking back. I thought Appalachia was horrible. I was embarrassed to be from there, and I just wanted to leave as soon as possible. I even tried to go to a private boarding high school because I could not get out of there fast enough. But what happened is I went off to Yale and I started studying psychology, and I found out that, oh my gosh, I was actually really poor. And a couple of things that really struck me when I got there. One, I found out that one of my new classmates' family had spent as much money buying a dining room table as my family of 10 earned in a year. And that was so striking to realize how different of a world that we kind of can live in with these extremes. And I think it's important to think about this for urban versus rural, because I went to it very green-eared. And I also found out that I was poor, and that it's actually terrible to grow up poor in terms of outcomes. I was taking these psychology classes, and the only thing worse than growing up poor is growing up poor in a poor community. In fact, one time when I told a professor that I was 5 out of 7 children, the professor said to me, "Well, that's a very high-risk position in the birth order." And I had faculty members there who were studying the opioid epidemic in my hometown and were fascinated and wanted to talk to me about it. And it was such an unusual experience, and I was actually also very academically unprepared, and I just really didn't quite know how to make sense of it. But you know what I did? As soon as I got out of college, I became a teacher. And I knew I wanted to go to a rural area, and I became a teacher on the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. And you know what really broke the ice? When I showed up, they had just sent a mission trip to Eastern Kentucky. So it was all good. We had a really good laugh about it. We had a sister class in Eastern Kentucky, and I taught in a school district that land area-wise is larger than the state of Delaware. Giant school district. I was in the most, at the time, remote and smallest school, and the school was closed my second year of teaching there. One thing that comes up in rural schools is what happens to a community when a rural school closes. So there you can see this is my second year of teaching. This is my class. We made a quilt to commemorate our school that they could hang up at the Board of Education. And you can see my students had 21 students and 3 had flushing toilets because that kind of infrastructure was pretty rare in the desert in the part of New Mexico that we're in. And what I kept on thinking about is I'm getting these kids, I taught all the first grade reading, although I mostly taught 3rd and 4th grade, and I was like, it is so late by the time they get here. We really need to think about early childhood. But everywhere I looked, and in my master's in education, nothing was really about the community I was serving. Nothing was about rural students. There were all these general best practices for reading, but it really didn't feel like it translated. In fact, there's a little boy in this picture that I love so much. He's the one with the glasses kind of going like this with his head. I can't quite point her to it, with his head below one of the quilt squares. And he was a child with dyslexic characteristics. And my mom, who was a teacher, sent me one of her old Dolce readers from the 50s, and it was called Pueblo Stories. And this child who'd never been able to read anything, I put a book in front of him about pueblos and mesas. Those are very advanced books. And he read them without any troubles. So many books were so different from the life that he'd known. The amount of background knowledge he had to build up to take to that book made that extra task of also decoding almost insurmountable. And it was such a lesson in how there are no bad readers. We put readers in bad context for them to fit their particular skills. That frustration of feeling like my community and this community I was serving was not represented made me want to go to grad school. And that is why I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I was particularly interested in understanding when we talk about poor children and how poverty is linked to bad reading outcomes, is that really as true as we think it is? Most of our research is done on urban children, not just urban children, mostly urban children in the Northeast, because that is where our major research universities and centers are. And I wanted to really get a better understanding of that. I did 7 years of research where I was comparing children in rural Appalachia to an economically matched sample in New England, and I can talk more about that later with people, but the short answer is our rural children did look different from what we typically think about as the profile of a reader that grows up in poverty. And that really pushed me to think about it all differently. And here's where there was a little bump in the road. I was there with my husband. He got his MBA actually, and then he went on, he was studying educational leadership, and we were at Harvard, and we were, doing the Harvard life, and we were living in Boston. It was really expensive. I was traveling all the time, but we were putting in the work, and we were going to go be professors, some big name place. And my mom got cancer. And that was this big shift in understanding suddenly where we were and were we happy? And honestly, we actually were really unhappy in Boston. We had to work crazy hours to afford our life. Even 8 years ago, full-time childcare was $2,500 a month for one child. So we really couldn't afford to live there. We didn't have the support system we wanted, and we actually weren't that happy with the educational experiences that our children were getting. My son was at a very fancy preschool that's often held up as an example of one of the best preschools, and you know what happened? They took a field trip and only took some children. They didn't take him to the theater. They said, we only took children who showed an interest. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm from a public school background. You take all children and you develop an interest in theater. You don't only take the kids who've already shown an interest. We really didn't love where we were. And so when my mom got cancer, we decided it was time to make a big shift, applied for a job back in Kentucky, and against everyone's wishes, advice, even my own family, we decided to move back to Kentucky. So we moved from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Harlan County, Kentucky, and that's where we live now. The littler kid you see in the picture, he's 8 years old now. He was 5 months old when we moved. His name is Perry. I was explaining earlier he has an unironic mullet because he wants to be a baseball player. And that's our older son, Harlan, and we live in a small town, so I'll tell you right now, the thing I am most known for is that my 12-year-old is 5'10" and 160 pounds, and there is big hope that he might one day contribute to the football or basketball team. I'm not going to give you any big promises. He's not particularly athletic, but when you're a small school trying to make it to regionals, sometimes it only takes one bigger boy on the team to help you out, right? So that's what people know us about there. And so it's really interesting because why rural education? It's our normal life. It's our everyday life. My kids go to a K-12 school. I understand there's some K-12 schools around here. It's pre-K through 12. It has 800 students. It is what is called a Title I school. It has a high percentage of children living in poverty. In fact, over 90% of the children going to the school live in poverty, so nobody fills out free lunch forms. Everybody qualifies for free lunch, no matter what. And actually, we get free Tom shoes and Bombas socks every year because Appalachia is one of the places that's picked for those kinds of charities. And you know what? I think it's cool. I think that my children learn all kinds of things they couldn't learn if they were living in a safe suburb. They learn about classmates who are struggling. It's all very real and very there. And I love them being there. I'll tell you, one of the big moments for me in the pandemic is every child who qualified for free lunch got an EBT card during the pandemic. Well, my children qualify for free lunch because we don't even apply. Every kid at the school just gets free lunch. And so in the mail, I got these 2 EBT cards. I grew up on food stamps. And I was like, I grew up wanting nothing more than to never, ever use a food stamp card again and never live in Eastern Kentucky. But there I was back there, and the thing I realized was, is this something that really united our community? Suddenly, it was something we were all doing. And honestly, I think I would love it if everybody that had a child got some support buying groceries. It wasn't a bad thing. But we attach so much shame sometimes to our rural communities, and especially our rural communities living in poverty, when in fact there are so many strengths and good things about them, even when you're like me and coming from perhaps one of the more extreme examples. The community of Harlan has an over 30% poverty rate and is one of the 20 poorest counties in America. And I am still telling you, it is a cool place to live. There are great people who live there, and it's a community with wonderful assets that's actually improving over time. And that's what we're going to talk about today, why we often underestimate what's going on with rural communities and the immense impact we can have in the educational system in them. I'm so excited to be here with you guys to talk about it because I don't often get to talk to an audience of people who are also from rural America. So I'm like, this is awesome. We can all just kind of cheer it on together and be like, we're in on the secret, right? I don't have to necessarily convince anyone. So let's take a moment and talk about what is rural. So rural is usually a designation that comes saying non-urban, right? If you're not urban, then sometimes you're rural. And it's often based on these census characteristics, based on population, proximity to a city. It's all very complicated. But the main thing that people think about is that rural populations are declining. So rural has often been seen as something that's in decline. Maybe it's dying out. And if something's dying or going away, then why would you invest in it? Why would you research it? Why would you think about it? And we're going to problematize that a little bit today and talk about why actually the population has changed a lot recently in all kinds of different configurations. But even with that, our rural population is still about 20% of our population. And to make it worse, we actually underestimate what is rural. So we have 3 examples here that we bring up in the book. And I'm going to just point out really quickly St. Louis County, Minnesota, because it's pretty close to here. It's a really large county. It covers over 900,000 acres of wildlands. The population density is very small, but because it includes the city of Duluth and its very southeastern corner, the entire county is considered metro. Think of all the children living out by the boundary waters that we all know are not urban, but by the way they're designated by the census, they're considered urban. So urban, rural, we vastly undercount how many students are actually rural. Even Harlan, Kentucky, which has a population now of 1,200, you're like, how in the world would you ever think that that place was metro? The reason why it is because when it was built to be a coal camp. So even though it's a town of 1,200, the population density is high because when the coal camp built it, they built all these houses right next to each other. So it still sometimes gets counted as an urban cluster, even though the biggest town is 1,200 people and you'd have to drive an hour and a half to reach an interstate. You know, these are rural places that are often mischaracterized. So even with this imperfect definition where we're super undercounting our rural population, we're still talking about 13 million children. And that's not a number to sniff at. These are a lot of children that we need to care about, that we need to think about, that we need to invest in. And to be clear, even if we put together the top 120 largest urban districts together in America, that still would not be as many children as we know about in our rural areas. For a long, long time, our educational policy has been very focused specifically on urban schools. In fact, a lot of times when people are talking about poverty, they don't say students living in poverty, they talk about urban schools. And that simply is not correct. And it leads to problems like inequitable funding. So this is something we need to problematize and actually talk about. Another thing we think a lot about in terms of rural schools is gaps in education. So it is true that there is a big gap in educational attainment for our rural students or non-metro, they're in red, versus our metro students. So, you know, it's interesting because when we first researched this book, it was a 13-point gap and has now grown to a 14-point gap. So this is something that actually has increased over time. We do not have as many people attaining their bachelor's degree or higher in our rural areas. So we know there's an educational attainment gap, and these are a lot of people. But it's also something we're going to talk a little bit more about because college degrees are wonderful, but one of the really interesting things that's happened over the last few years is a realization that it's not everything, right? We want those degrees for the people they fit, but we also want wonderful other options, wonderful technical career education as well. So let's talk a little bit about the unique challenges faced by rural areas. One of these is this idea of forced out-migration. Now, I'm so glad to hear that here in Platteville, we have students who are excited to become rural teachers and go back and serve in the rural communities that they're from or nearby. For so long, the idea that's been pursued in the field of education is that anybody who is highly educated is going to want to move on and leave. Let's talk about, there's one classic book called Hollowing Out the Middle, and it's all about a community in Iowa where they send off their best and brightest students. And that has been something that we have thought a lot about in education, and I'm not sure that it's been the right direction to go. This idea that if you pursue post-secondary education, you're going to have to leave, it's the brain drain, and also this idea that then the way we teach our rural students is we teach them away from their community. We basically have to show them ways that they can leave and have other opportunities. At the same time, a very real challenge that rural schools face is limited funding. Very clear that foundations do not often support rural communities. The funding is incredibly discrepant. Philanthropist foundations are primarily serving urban communities. Title I funding that's there and earmarked to help students living in poverty is distributed at the state level, and states distribute that money in very uneven ways and typically provide it primarily to the urban centers and not to their rural students that are farther out. So there's a disproportionate funding problem there where they do not get the funds allocated per their population. And then we know that it actually is more expensive to provide education in rural communities. There's all kinds of things. We talked today about transportation cost. Transportation costs alone can be tremendous for a rural community, and it's also variable. So when gas prices go up, that superintendent has no control over the budget that suddenly this line item has just ballooned. Fixed costs of building, administration are just higher in our rural areas. So, You know, it is a challenging context often to teach in, less funding, generally because it's less population dense. You're starting with a lower amount of money to fund your schools to start with your tax base. Then you're not getting the philanthropic money. You're not getting donations from wealthy families in the community necessarily. And even federal monies earmarked to support those schools are not landing necessarily where they should. But the cool thing is rural communities are resilient, and we have a lot of things to talk about as strengths. Rural communities are also very different. I'm going to talk about this more, but we talk about 3 different areas where really impact a rural community, and they are leadership, economic vitality, and population stability. Population stability can go 2 ways. Sometimes a rural community will have a sudden influx of new citizens, you know, something like a meat packing plant opens and there's a sudden influx. And especially this can be challenging when there's a sudden influx of immigrant students who maybe don't speak English as their first language into a rural community that hasn't had the time or experience to build up a program that's appropriate for language minority learners. In some places, the population is declining over time, sometimes slowly and sometimes quickly. But all of these things will have a really big impact on how forces are at play in our various rural communities. Economic vitality is something that we know very well in agricultural communities like this. There's good years, there's bad years. There's been terrible years for the dairy industry with floods and things like that at points. It's very clear in mining communities, the coal mining communities that I'm from, it's boom, it's bust. We've lost 80% of coal jobs over the last 20 years. So that is just an economic decline that just has a tremendous impact. My husband, again, he's from northern Minnesota, the Mesabi Iron Range. Iron's doing well now. It's not always done well, and guess what? It's doing well now. It's not going to do well in the future, and that adds a lot of vulnerability, variability to a community. But the big one I'm going to talk a lot tonight is leadership, because the kind of leaders we have in our communities and in our schools make a big difference. And this is where the leaders are being developed and grown. And I know it's hard when you're a college student teacher to realize what a big leader you are, but not only are you a leader, but we have to start thinking about our community leaders as being the students in our classrooms, and not think about importing talent or knowledge from someplace else, but building it up from the ground up. You know, and especially when it comes to grant money and things like that. Where is that going? Whose taxes are it paying? How can we make sure those things are often redistributed within our own community? So let's talk about some of these strengths of rural communities. Some of them people would not find surprising, like greater connection to the natural world and foodways. We actually have talked about this a lot today with the students. You know, it's amazing that here in Wisconsin, you guys are going to be able to feed yourselves if our whole global supply chain falls apart. You know, you'll have the dairy, you'll have the eggs, you'll have the meat, you have vegetables. You have, I've heard, students here who know how to process deer meat in their own apartment. We do that in Kentucky too, but that is really an amazing skill. Awesome. I mean, right now the big thing going on in Kentucky is we have morel mushrooms, so there's a lot of kids out foraging. Foraging is a big thing. We have strong, deep, and stable family ties and social networks. That is an incredible asset, particularly for children who are at risk. This has been shown over and over again. You can be from a very difficult family, and if you have strong and stable relationships, that's going to be so important to help you overcome and still meet your potential. We have highly qualified, excellent educators. Look at the students I have met today. I am just so impressed. I can just imagine what kind of teachers we have here in the local community. Because our schools are so central, some of our very best people, and especially women, if you look at the numbers, end up in our schools being wonderful leaders for the community, really working with those children. And not only are they there, but they have a deep cultural knowledge. They'll know when a family is going through a hard time. They understand when it's the first day of deer season and someone doesn't show up, or it's harvest time. And that matters for children. What surprises people is to hear that often our rural communities are quite diverse. And what we see are greater socioeconomic and racial integration. I'm not saying broadly, but I'm saying within the schools. So when you have a rural school, everyone has to go there. You know, you'd have to go to tremendous lengths to ship off to another place. Or, you know, maybe you go to the neighboring town school because you get mad because you were in trouble, but you're still not getting that far away, right? So what that means is that whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you voted for this person or that person, suddenly you're all together in the same school, and you know you're going to be there for a while. You can't just cut those people off and think that you're going to go out and make new friends. So that means there's a level of conversation that can be had because we know these relationships are enduring. We've seen this at play in our own family. Our oldest is in 7th grade now. He argues with his friends over social issues with the way I wish the rest of our country could. They get in there and they battle about should we have environmental regulations or should his friend's dad be allowed to timber. They argue about things like do Black Lives Matter and they don't agree. But guess what? They talk about it and they're still friends the next day. This is what our country could probably stand a bunch more of. Not to put anyone in a bad position. You know, I'm not saying that anyone should be disrespected or made to be traumatized, but to be in a position where we can start to talk openly and cross borders. This is an area where often our rural schools are in the lead. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not saying we don't have problems with racism or issues like that in rural America, but they're often more out in the open, and you can't sort of politely put them away by moving to the nice neighborhood and going to the nice school, which is much more common in other places. So this is where rural is definitely misunderstood, and I come back to this map for a reason. People often think rural communities are just white. Maybe they think we're all farmers, just white farmers. Maybe they think we're all white coal miners. Maybe they think we're all conservative or whatever else. And yeah, you know what? A lot of us are white. It's true. I know I am. And maybe quite a few of us are farmers or other things like that. But the true story of rural is much more diverse. And it doesn't do us any favors to pretend that rural is a monolith. Not only do we have our native nations, not only do we have places like the Deep South, if you look at a place like Harlan, Kentucky, I put this on there. There's a wonderful book that recently came out called The Harlan Renaissance. And it was written by an African-American man named Dr. Bill Turner. I didn't realize until I read his book that for families, for black families who were coming out of slavery in the South and had been working on cotton farms, cotton plantations, getting to go to a coal mine was a huge economic step up. It was a way for them to get out of the Deep South. It was a step on. That man, he's now in his 80s, grew up in a segregated coal camp in eastern Kentucky, and he's got his PhD now. And not only that, he writes about all types of people that he knew who've been launched into great careers. People aren't thinking about Appalachia as a place of, upward social mobility for African American families in the Deep South at this moment of time in history. And all around in our communities, we have complex stories like that, some nice, some really difficult. But when we pretend that rural is a monolith, we don't get the chance to understand the complexity that's part of our nation, part of our story, and part of what we want to embrace. And I'm sure that if I spent more time in Wisconsin, I would hear lots of interesting stories about the different ways people came into and left these communities, and they would all play such a big role in shaping what they are and what people have gone on to do. Now, one thing we've talked a lot about is this idea of the rural economy, because for the longest time, we had this idea that agriculture and manufacturing is over, and now it's all about the service industry. That it's all about globalization, and I was saying this earlier, we're gonna have a plastic fork, like we're gonna go eat with a plastic fork that was made halfway across the globe and shipped to us. But this idea that we just get people, we get them college educated, and then we put them in a black box where they go to a city and have a professional job is not necessarily the reality of our current world, and it's not necessarily what's best for our communities or for our environment. And one thing that COVID really made us understand was how fragile our global supply chains are and how much we have lost touch with some of our local foodways and production. And again, better for the environment, better for our communities, better for us if we know how to grow some of our own food healthier, better quality. Why would we give that up? The other piece that isn't often addressed is that in the United States, internal migration is shifting. So if you look at this map for the urban core, you can see that urban populations have been declining. People have been moving out of cities, in fact. Now, yes, there was a huge drop after COVID where you see that drop down, but it's not new. People, in fact, have been for a while moving away from cities. Even our suburban communities, they peaked in, I believe, 2016, but now they're also on the decline. Not something we talk a lot about. We think about dying rural communities. We don't necessarily talk about how this is a much more complex picture than we often talk about. Look at the growth rate in Manhattan and San Francisco, particularly check out San Francisco, and I bet if we had more recent data, we would see an even sharper decline in San Francisco. Again, this idea that you go to a city and you make it in tech or biotech or whatever industry is not necessarily playing out. A lot of these places have really struggled with the pandemic. A lot of vacant storefronts, a lot of social issues have emerged. And if you look at this, there's a decline in job options in urban areas. And actually, if we had very recent data, we would see that the most recent data bears this out the most. Right now, if you're looking for a job, you kind of don't want to be looking for a office job in a big city. That's where some of our fewest opportunities are. One thing I talk about is in my community, some of the best paid people I know are CDL drivers. We have a great need for skilled trades. We have a great need. There's a factory in my town that makes electric batteries for cars. That is a really high-paying job. That's an important job. And for a long time, we kind of turned our back away from that kind of work when it no longer fits the reality of where our country is at. So this is why rural America is so important, and this is why education is so important. Take a look at this, entrepreneurship per 1,000 residents. Who are the most entrepreneurial people in America? Who are the most likely to get out there and start their own business? Are actually rural people. We cite this study in the book by Raj Chetty, who's a wonderful scholar, that when he did research, he found the greatest upward social mobility was in the most rural of towns, which makes sense. When you don't have a lot of people in town, you start hoping that kid can play basketball. Or, you start needing that kid, no matter what family he's from, to take that job or start that business or come work on the farm that summer. So we tend to give people more opportunities. And as a teacher, going into the field, this is so cool. Think of what your students could be doing. They're not limited to just being an office worker or a dairy farmer. They have the opportunity to look around their community, decide what it needs, and go out there and make it happen. And that is a completely different way of thinking about and educating our students and saying, here, I'm going to give you these standards so you can score this score on this test and then go off to college. This is saying, I want to work with you to give you the skills so that you can be a great communicator, so that you can analyze some numbers, so that you can look around and decide what you want your community to be like. And the way it is now isn't the way it has to be. You know, maybe family farms have gotten too expensive and some have had to sell them off, but maybe there's a way forward where we can start to have small farms again that's, you know, are able to do this produce, where we can start thinking about a different kind of community. And nowhere is there greater access to this economic and social mobility than in our rural communities. And nowhere can you have a bigger impact on students in doing this than here. And you know what the other cool thing is you can even teach yourself and maybe start a coffee shop or something else that you would like to do. Because you'll have support, you might have time in the summer, and again, there's that opportunity and option. So I just want to touch on these last few points quickly. One is it is still very real that the digital divide hurts students, especially when we're talking about this entrepreneurship. Obviously, if there's really great internet in place, really great data in place, it really expands the universe of opportunities for our students for what they can go out there and do and accomplish. I really think about this more with some of our more advanced students. If you have a lot of students who are behind and you have someone advanced, there's wonderful programs like Khan Academy that are very rigorous that you could work with that student and get that student on. At the same time, we talked a little bit today about how, yeah, we might want there to be great internet, but maybe one of our secrets in rural America is we don't get too attached to the devices. You know, I think the elephant in the room is whether you were in person or not after COVID, everybody's scores went down. And I'm not sure it's a coincidence. That's also when everybody started using Chromebooks. You know, I have no research to back that up, just an observation. But people make a lot of money selling Chromebooks, right? So definitely digital divide. I think it's less of an issue here. It's a huge issue where I live. I was saying I can drive an hour and a half between two towns and I only get data for 5 minutes of that drive. Only about a third of the students where I live have internet access. So like when the pandemic happened, they weren't able to do synchronous instruction because not only was there no internet, there wasn't data to stream on a phone. So that is a big issue in terms of policy. It's something we need to think about. We need to think about internet as a basic human right, the way we used to think about telephones. But I don't want us in this room to get focused on that. You know, I think here we can think about who needs it, who's being left out, but how can we move forward? What I really want us to think about is this idea of the brain drain. Most people live near where they grew up. This is not an urban, rural, suburban phenomenon, especially in our current economic reality. It's just really expensive to have a family and have children and not have any family support nearby. So for a long time, we've thought people need to leave. And what you guys have already discovered is there can be a great life close to home. And this is something we need to accept as normal and valuable and real, even in our very rural communities. Most students live close or go to school close to where they grew up. That's why it's wonderful to have strong schools of education in places like this. You all are educating the people of the community. And it is true that rural educations are often what they call higher education deserts. They don't necessarily have those community colleges there. But again, we need to stop thinking of brain drain as a dichotomous variable. Either people graduate and they leave or they don't. I was 35 when I moved back to Kentucky. I never thought I would, but I'm happy to be there now. And I think we see that over time. People hit different life phases and they shift their thinking about where they want to be. Where you live when you're 19 or 20 or 25 isn't necessarily where you're going to be living later on. So let us take away the thought that there's bad communities that all the good people are going to leave, and instead shift our thinking to what could this community be? Where has it been? Where might it be going? And how can we work with our students and our communities to help it get to where we collectively would like to see it go? So here are some of the quick educational implications, and I'll close here. Schools are powerful economic actors. Not just because in some communities they employ a lot of people, and that's true, that's important, and that is on its own very valuable. But also because they can act as these very important catalysts towards diversification and development. They can really help people think about what might be in a community. And most of our very small communities are already seen as so central, as so important, as such a social center for sports and things like that. So it's not hard to take that existing strength and move forward. We want to make sure that the community is engaged, not just as learners, but again, also as leaders. If we're going to build the kind of communities we want, we've got to get everyone on board. Coaches, churches, the local businesses, and not just to give money to the volleyball fundraiser, right? But to actually be there and become involved in it. And as long as we're thinking of a school as a place where everybody can learn and grow, it will be a very important part of the community. And we want to start thinking about instruction that will expand on students' experiences. We want cultural toolkits. We don't want our students to think, oh, I'm just rural and this is it. We want them to get to go to different cities and see different ways of being. We want them to interact with people and to feel comfortable in lots of different contexts. We don't want somebody to feel nervous if they have to put on a suit and shake someone's hand and go to a big city for a job interview. We don't want to close ourselves up and be like, yay, rural, that's all there is. No. We want something that can do both, where we can be proud of our rural heritage, where we can understand its good parts and its bad parts, the challenges we might face. And so when we're teaching, we aren't just thinking about a set of standards, we're thinking about a set of experiences that will give our students the cultural experiences and language and knowledge where they can go other places and say, yes, I see that thing and I want it for my community, and I can start to see how I can make it happen here. I've been so excited to be in Wisconsin and think about how Kentucky can improve by the examples that you all set and the way that this school of education does things. This rural-centered play space is very rare. It's very often in a place you don't know what a jewel you have, but this is very, very special what is going on in this location, and something that I'm just very excited that I get to be around. So we want that kind of experiences for our rural students. And where they'll get it is when we have deep units of learning, where we're really starting to feel good about having real conversations, thinking about what's going on, and thinking across different contexts. And the great thing in rural schools is we can often make this happen. We might not necessarily be represented in the data the way that we want, but we have that chance to step up and be a big part of the community and envisioning a future that we can all want together. So with that, I think we're going to go to a discussion with Doug, or questions and comments. Thank you.
I just need my questions.
Okay, there.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, thank you.
Hello again.
Hello, and thank you, Sky, for that absolutely dynamite presentation. So, my first question, in talking with you earlier today and with discussion with our students, is you've often mentioned the sort of complexity of rural throughout your presentation and your discussion in your book. And so what advice do you have for our teachers as they develop their own rurally responsive, socially just definition that they can then help students understand the complexities of rural as well?
Well, the great thing about being a teacher is that you can model being a learner. And I say all the time, both parenting and teaching teaches you humility. So going out into the community and learning is one of the best ways you can do this. I again, I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, but I think about it very differently now than I did as a child. And still learning things about the community that I didn't know. One thing we talk a lot about in the book is oral histories and putting teachers and parents and community members and the role of our teachers. So again, I was saying all of our communities have stories behind them that we may not be aware of. And the more we can find out about those stories, the more that we can engage with that, the more we can invite that into our classroom, the better we're going to get at having those conversations about who's in our community and who's benefited from this and who hasn't. And it's all part of building strong relationships, right? Relationships come around having conversations of understanding. Now, I told a few people today that a couple of my favorite experiences when I was in teacher training, one was riding a bus route and seeing where students got off the bus. You know, we don't always know where our students live and the kind of houses and who's greeting them at the door. And another one was interviewing a parent and learning more about where she came from and what her experiences were with school. And I'll tell you, the parent I interviewed had some very traumatic experiences with school. It wasn't easy to hear about. But I went back as a teacher with a better understanding of things my students might be dealing with and what was going on in the classroom and how that intersected with our curriculum.
That's awesome. I really think about, like you mentioned, the sort of sedimented histories within our own communities that are worth talking about because the infinitely complex individuals that live there make that community so special. Mm-hmm. So when I was teaching at All Good, Tennessee, where it's all good and all good on the sign, you mentioned that for my students, they probably heard that like 50 times.
I'm going to have to go to All Good, Tennessee now.
So I really think that talking about and collecting stories is a critical piece of this to disrupt this sort of rural is misunderstood. So how can we collect those stories that are infinitely complex and broadcast them to make to take advantage and like take the sort of like rural narrative that we want to tell?
Well, I mean, and some of that work is getting started here. I was so fortunate to be interviewed for a podcast earlier. Like that kind of stuff is really cool. But I think this is really another thing that's right now about co-discovery. I mean, somebody was telling me today about a TikTok about Appalachia, and I was like, that's so cool. We have more chances than ever before to share some of these stories. But my invitation, especially for the students in the audience, is to also think about some of those formal channels, things like state capitals and representatives. And we were talking about this today. The Thompson Center is a tremendous asset to, you know, they have a wonderful website. I've spent some time looking at it with some resources on it. We shouldn't think that those conversations are city conversations, state capital conversations. We should start thinking about how can we be part of that. Now, the fun thing about teaching is even with young kids, you can invite them to be part of that conversation. So if there's something you're like, well, I don't know who my state rep is, well, guess who else probably doesn't know who your state rep is? Those 20 second graders in your classroom who can suddenly learn and think about who are they and what is an issue they'd like to write to them about. We were asking earlier today, some of the people from the Thompson Center at dinner, how do you affect policy? And what really resonated with me was this idea that politicians are really moved by personal stories, way more than data or numbers, which is true. I think all of us are much more moved by personal stories than by hearing, well, 30% of, you know, whatever. So the more we can practice that, the better we'll get at it and the less we'll be afraid when we're in that setting. But then think about what we're also doing for our students as they move forward as citizens in their lives.
That's awesome. I really think the idea around leveraging the assets of our localized communities and seeing them as stakeholders and partners in our education is huge. So what advice do you have for our students as they transition to the other side of the desk? It's a bad joke pile. And as how can they become really responsive in that sort of way to help leverage? I know you talked about the sort of idea around like writing letters to your local legislators, but what sort of things can they do in their local community as well?
Well, I think when you start teaching, it's so overwhelming. So first of all, your first year of teaching or two, give yourself some grace. It's really hard. So go in there, love on the students, and just remember, love the students first. And you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. Okay? As long as you love them, it'll all, and most of the time, you don't have to love them all the time, but it's all going to be okay. But then try not to get caught up in the grind of, I have to check off these marks. And I know it's going to be really hard because you're going to be evaluated and you're going to be tested and you're going to feel like you're failing sometimes if test scores and things like that are not where they want to be. But that is what leads to burnout and despair. And you'll know when you're filling your cup. You'll know when you're doing good teaching because it will feel good for you and it will feel good for your students. And when you get those moments where you can think, okay, how do I not just make this about a compass rose and map skills or whatever it might be, and how do I make this something that's just a little bit more meaningful? It doesn't mean you have to do everything, okay? What, especially research on advanced literacy skills, what helps you communicate, go to college, all those things, is that less is more and deeper is better. So just think about maybe one or two units of study where you can go really deep on a topic. Get into it more. Your students are going to build all this background knowledge, all this language. It will help them do more and more complex things. And in that, just one to start with. How do you start engage? How do you make your thing on surveys about a community needs assessment? How do you, do a survey about what people want to see in their community? Like those little steps, and build on it from there. And anytime you see another teacher doing something awesome, steal it. That's what it's all about. That would be my other piece of advice.
That is absolutely huge. I think that seeing our teachers as assets in our communities, as also, like you mentioned earlier, as being local leaders, that is so empowering for our future aspiring educators to hear. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome individuals for questions. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh, I've had such a blast today.
Okay, if you have a question, you'll raise your hand. Who's got a question? Gives you a cookie if you ask a question. Thank you, Alex. Yes, sugar cookies, yes.
Hello? Okay, excellent. Thank you again for speaking today. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask, we talk a lot about the assets of rural schools and things that, taking advantage of all of the specific things that make individual community special. I wanted to ask you, where do you find the balance between, I think on one of the slides you used the word like cultural toolkit for each individual community. Where do you find the balance between individual cultural literacy toolkits for your individual community versus the broader like U.S. culture?
Absolutely. One thing, that's a great question. And one thing I feel like I've said a lot of times today is things that are worth doing are not often easy, and not often you can say, well, here's step 1, 2, 3, and it gets it all done. I think the biggest piece is just trying to do it, and knowing that when you try to, help your students learn about their local community and also embed things in things like the national news or field trips or outside speakers, it's sometimes not going to work. Sometimes it's going to fall flat on its face. Sometimes the students will be bored and they don't like it. Or, I remember my first year of teaching, I thought I did this amazing unit on Black History Month, and when it was over and I asked my students to write their reflections, a bunch of them wrote that they learned that white people were bad and they did racism. And I was like, oh, whoops, I didn't mean, that's not what I was trying to communicate, but I tried, right? And then I had a starting point to recalibrate what message I had sent, what message did I want to send, whereas if I'd never even touched it, I wouldn't have anywhere to go. So, it comes back to that whole reflective practice, action learning, action research. As long as you're trying to do it, you're not going to nail it every single time, but you're going to start finding the right pathway, and you're going to start finding what works. Of course, then you'll do it the next year, and different students will react differently, but that too will help you gauge where you want to go. And it's so hard to both think about content and what's going on in the world and what's going on locally, but it's important. I will also add this. I find that sometimes our rural students worry about national news even though it might not impact them. So sometimes they have fears that we can help uncover and, you know, put them at ease and say, okay, no, you don't actually need to worry about this hurricane, or we don't have hurricanes in Wisconsin, or whatever it might be, or, you know, the shooting that happened was at not here. So sometimes too, in having that dialogue, you can bring up fears. Sometimes the great thing is you'll be able to put them at ease. Sometimes it'll open up conversations you don't expect, but the path forward is just moving forward, I feel like.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else?
So we talk a lot about place-based education here. So I'm just curious, what aspect of place-based education do you remember from your K-12 experience, and how did that stand out to you?
You know, the interesting thing I think about with some of my place-based education were actually things that where I felt very ashamed of my family. I came from, you know, kind of a ratty family, for lack of a better word, or times where people were made fun of for having an accent. I don't have much of an accent anymore, but so I think we need to hold on to the fact that sometimes we can inadvertently not do the right thing with that. And I don't say that to make anyone afraid, because again, we are all going to make mistakes, and as long as we're dialoguing and talking about it and learning from it, that is good. But I think, you know, I went to school and I don't think we ever talked about being in Appalachia. And I remember my first year of teaching, the state came and looked at our school, and one of the comments they had was, this is a school that serves an entirely Native American population, and if you walked in, there's no visual representation of that. You wouldn't be able to tell. So I think this is a change that's happening. And now when you walk into classrooms, and I would say the same thing is now true in Eastern Kentucky, you'll see murals that represent the mountains, you'll see things about local authors, you know, you'll start to see like the greenhouses and local foods and stuff. But this is not something that's always been in place. You know, again, education has for a while been that sterile red, yellow, blue, here's the colors, here's the numbers. So, you know, the more you can think about those pieces, try local food, all that kind of stuff, I do think we're moving things forward right now. And I'll love to talk to some of you if you've had great experiences about what those might be.
Thank you so much.
One of the things you'd said that really stood out to me was the connection that you had in New Mexico back to the school that you were from in Kentucky. And as you were talking, that idea of that understanding that you're rural and those connections between rural districts across the United States, or really the globe, I guess that really has me intrigued, because I would love to see our community partner with different rural communities, because I think that educates our students about their place base, but also then starts building those connections. And just curious if that was something that you kind of continued to build, or if there's a system that you kind of developed to continue those partnerships, probably isn't the right word, but just connections between rural places.
Oh, let me tell you, I have a wonderful story about that. I was teaching 5th grade. Who here has read My Side of the Mountain? Anyone here? Okay. So one of the pieces in it is this kid kind of runs away from home, and he's living in a giant tree. And I was doing the read aloud hatchet, and the students were group reading My Side of the Mountain. Well, this is the desert of New Mexico, and we were trying to imagine what it would be like to live in the forest and live in these big trees. Well, we had our sister classroom in Harlan County, and they sent us a box of leaves. So we got this box of leaves, and I was so excited, and we opened it up in the classroom, and all we did for like 20 minutes was sniff the smell of the forest floor. That was from a box of wet leaves, and that's all it took. And it was so, and I have to tell you, I was so homesick in that moment, that smell of leaves in the early fall when, you know, it's just, they've just fallen and it's a little bit wet outside. I do think that partnerships with other rural communities can be especially strong because there is already a kind of connection. It's interesting right now, actually, my son's middle school, they have pen pals in Alaska, and it's through one of these rural partnership things, and it's a native community in Alaska. Then they aren't worried that they are already uncool compared to the city middle schoolers. Like, it's okay. So they have these kind of like letters that they send back and forth, and one's like, well, you know, we don't have bears all the time, but we did have this one issue with bears, and, you know, so they can get right to it. And I think that connecting rural communities is something we don't do enough of, because again, we do not currently have a really great knowledge base of what works for rural communities, and we're only going to get there when we're like, wow, Mississippi is doing this, and that was great, and Tennessee's doing this, and that's awesome, and look at what they're doing here in Wisconsin, and that's great. It's when we start to see, or maybe we could adjust that a little bit and it would work for us. But I do think, again, if you go into some of these deeper units of study, if you can really try to deeply understand something with that connection to another community, that really enriches it. And, you know, they ended up like giving each other gifts, and I mean, it was all kinds of beautiful, wonderful things that we had in this partnership with the other classroom. And hey, if anyone's looking for a partner in Kentucky, I might have a hookup for you, especially like third grade.
Thank you.
Hi, Sky. There's a big dialogue, and there has been for recent years, I think, about national literacy rates in the United States for children and how our nationwide data has kind of stayed stagnant when you look. And at one time, maybe we were the leader, and now we are seeing sometimes other countries gaining while ours is staying flat. I know that's a conversation that continues into the state as well of Wisconsin. You mentioned that your work for 7 years was examining, if I'm saying this right, literacy rates of rural communities versus the urban. Can you summarize a little bit about what your findings were?
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, the findings were that just one of the big things that's been found in the research on literacy is just how much talk you've gotten to hear as a small child has a big impact on your later literacy rates. Well, my rural Appalachian sample of children were in these multi-generational families where they were actually around a lot of different conversations, and you have to be pretty sharp to keep up with some of these mountain conversations. You have to be a good conversationalist. And children were allowed to participate if they were keeping up their end of the deal and being funny or, you know, whatever. So in terms of just oral vocabulary skills versus some of the urban students who sometimes spend a lot of time alone because they might have a parent who is doing a lot of work to be able to afford housing. Some of them had much less chances to hear conversation. My rural students had much less exposure to preschool and to books. So when it came to book knowledge, they were far behind. Now, in that particular context in Kentucky, there was very strong phonics instruction. So their phonics skills were very strong by the end of kindergarten. But some of that deeper knowledge and exposure to just books and hearing great high quality literature and recognizing books was quite a bit lower. I do think after the pandemic, we are going to struggle with literacy, and I do think that one of the strengths we have in rural communities, especially K-12 schools, is we have older and younger classmates who can be reading with each other. And it seems like we've gotten away from the idea a little bit that children actually need to hold, see, hear, read real physical books, and that hearing those stories and high quality stories is so important. So, you know, that's slightly different from your question, and I'm just stepping on a soapbox for like just a moment, but I do feel like that is something that is so important, especially in rural communities, because again, One of the things we talk about in the book is this example of a peer. How do you know what a peer is? You know, my 8-year-old has no mental concept of a peer. You get that from a book. You read enough books about the seaside. I mean, think about some of you all, what you read as young adults, and you learned about whole contexts that you actually had never visited because you learned about them through books. So when you can't take that field trip, but you have that unit about the ocean and you read multiple books about it, you'll see your students' knowledge deepening. And because we are so community-based, bring in those older grandparents to read or listen to students. Bring in those older students, and let's start leveraging the fact that we have a community of people that, if nothing else, can listen to the fumbling words of a second grader sometimes, or can read them a great book if that's not something they're going to be able to get at home.
Other questions?
So you had touched a little bit on the greater diversity that we have in our rural populations. So one of the questions I had, coming from a Spanish education background, how do we accommodate the growing population of Latinos, or the greater diversity that we're going to have, to accommodate them into the place-based education if they're not necessarily if there are English learners?
This is not going to be an easy quick fix, but I will say children are very social people. So if you're talking about the local community, they're new into a community, it's going to help them. They're going to also understand it better. What the heck is going on? Oh, now this is starting to make sense. It actually is worse, I feel like, for our new coming students to just think that they should understand how the community works, right? It's when we make some of those things transparent that we help them actually enter, and we help all of us be a better community. And, I do think that we don't, if you see children interact with each other, they want to learn some Spanish. They want to learn more about where these other students are from. There's so much natural curiosity that we get on our, okay, we've got, these are my learning objectives, or these are the, it's time for this or time for that. There are a lot of opportunities there. And again, if you're learning English, you need to hear people talk in English a lot. So just don't forget that classmates and peers are one of the most awesome ways to learn another language. So giving them that time to converse, how fun would it be for your students to give somebody a history or a tour, imagining they're new to the place? They'd have to think about it in a totally different way. So this is where the fun, creative, juicy art part of teaching comes in. We don't give ourselves enough time to think about it. We don't give ourselves enough time to collaborate or talk with other teachers. But when you start thinking about it, you can come up with some really, really great ideas. And I don't think the two things are opposing at all. I think everybody does better when they kind of understand what's been going on in a community.
Hi, you talked about leadership somewhat, and I was curious what your thoughts were with FFA and 4-H, as me being a member of them, and what you thought of them with the rule and how they're very much incorporated.
Oh, did somebody tell you to ask me that because I love talking about this, or no?
No, nobody did. I'm just part of it, and I absolutely love it.
Oh my gosh, I love especially FFA is such an amazing leadership opportunity. Let me tell you a few reasons why FFA and 4-H are amazing. They have these different events where students have to go and they get dressed up for it and they do these presentations. I mean, talk about learning, talk about getting comfortable in different contexts, meeting people from other places. Very high STEM component to FFA. Wonderful, complex thing that we need to give more time, money, and attention to. I don't know how it works here, but in my community, the FFA actually runs a greenhouse, and I have a restaurant that our salads all come from our local FFA greenhouse at the high school, which is awesome. 4-H too, all kinds of opportunities for students to participate in photography and public speaking, and there's this wonderful country ham program and things like that. The other thing I love about them is they are actually kind of rural centered. So I was telling a few people, I just signed my 2 boys up for 4-H camp, and my favorite part of the sign up process was they said, where do you live? Okay, there were 3 options. In town, in the country, on a farm. And I was like, I have never seen something. It was not like, it was like, yeah, that's right. You either live in town or in the country. I don't know if that's how it is here, or on a farm. And those are truly our local designations. And I was like, heck yeah, we live in town. But, you know, this one buddy lives in the country, you know, where they are. So, it's such a great way for children to embrace, again, some of these skills. You know, they're going to go to 4-H camp and practice shooting a gun, and then that'll help them hunt someday, which is a great source of meat. So I definitely think those are programs that are often underutilized. Your local extension office, I was telling people, I was actually a state extension specialist. Wonderful potential partner if you have students wanting to start a business, especially around food. Send them to the extension first. They should know all the rules about home-based processors, what you need to do for the farmer's market. They're great partners. I know sometimes they might need to be engaged depending on who the particular individual is, and there's strengths and there's weaknesses everywhere, right? But we need more of that in our schools. We need more of those extracurricular activities. And remember, especially when it comes to things like STEM, we find that people who wouldn't otherwise consider a STEM career, you know, when they get comfortable with it, is an out-of-school time. So something like FFA, if they're out there learning how to do some kind of scientific skill, that's when they start to build what we call a disciplinary identity, where they're like, well, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could see myself doing that. So, I mean, to say I love it doesn't really give an answer other than to say, yes, let's do that. Let's be engaged. And honestly, in a rural community, the way you do it is you do it by volunteering. You do it by helping them fundraise. You do it by lifting them up and participating in all of those pieces. But heck yeah to both 4-H and FFA.
Thank you. I'm an ag ed major. That's why
wonderful.
I thought I'd ask. us 3, and this is the ag ed advisor.
Oh, wow. I should have said it. No, just kidding.
Extra credit for that question, right? Other questions? Oh, yes, please.
I have a second one. So I did a little bit of growing up in North Carolina, and that might be where my accent's really kind of messed up a little bit. But, you know, we have this really big push in the university to study abroad and study in a different country. What are your thoughts on, instead of doing abroad, doing study in a different state, doing like a collaboration between, because of the 37% of adults not leaving their hometown?
You know, first of all, I will say that I think study abroad is awesome. Again, it comes back to, we can love rural and still go to Malaysia for a semester. And I didn't do study abroad in college. It was tough at that time with financial aid, and I still kind of regret that. I wish I had taken that time, because again, you know, we don't want to go crazy on globalization, but we want to be able to interact fluidly with people from all over, and we do have people from all over the globe coming into our communities. At the same time, we often joke, study abroad in rural America. So I do think we underestimate how much you can learn by just, you know, it was tremendous for me to go live in New Mexico. You know, New Mexico was very different from Kentucky. I went to college in Connecticut. Connecticut was nothing like Kentucky. So I think it does come back to those experiences where you get out of your comfort zone. And again, a lot of it's how we position it. We're not saying you need to get out of here to have a successful life. It's like, let's have these experiences. You can go forth. We're not so scared that if you taste a different fruit, you'll never want to come back here again, right? It's like, go, try that out. See what you like. I mean, in some ways, it's like parenting. Like, yeah, I'm doing terrible things as a parent. When you grow up, do some of the things you like and don't do others, right? It's like, go to that other community. See what's cool about it. See what we might be missing here. Maybe bring it back, but you know, those kinds of experiences are all very important, and I think should be valued. I do think we do need to pay a little extra attention for our rural students, because if you don't meet a lot of different people as you're growing up, it can just be a little bit extra scary. So it's something that little things like going to 4-H camp gets you a little bit more, going to state FFA conference, all those little things get you a little bit more comfortable with going out there, greeting somebody, meeting them, building up that comfort zone that will let us help our students move on. Again, have that broad range of experiences we don't need to be afraid there's something so amazing out there they'll never come back, right?
I have a question about, you talked about STEM in rural areas. Could you speak to arts in rural areas and arts experiences for children in rural schools?
Yeah, just another great one because, again, I think we have really overlooked that art can be an important part of community revitalization, that it can be actually a viable career path for people. And even if not, it's something that engages students who might not otherwise be engaged or feel like they're a part of the school, and that's in and of itself really important. And one of the things we talk about in our book is Montana has a really cool entrepreneur program where they work with people in the state to really develop themselves, not just as artists, but also as business people. So I think, you know, anytime somebody has a great talent, even if it's, you know, athletics or whatever it might be, it's really helpful to think about how do we combine that with something to make it also push towards like, okay, this is really great. Now let's add the public speaking or communication part that you'll need to be able to go out there and sell your art, or to get on stage and sing without fear, or the business piece that you're going to need if you're going to run a studio. And same thing with, you know, if you have dreams of being a professional athlete, you're going to have some skills that you're going to need to develop. So, you know, again, I think the great thing is that flexibility to know what skills students have. Then, you know, sometimes when you're a small town, you know who that person is. You can connect them with for other art opportunities. But, you know, absolutely, again, we've been so focused on certain content, we've forgotten some of the pieces that just make us human. And art, beauty, all of those things are very worthwhile and are important to our students. I think they're wanting to say one last, this is
One more
last
question? Do you have one, or you want one more? One more. Okay. Who wants the last question? Okay.
Thanks for such a great presentation. And, you know, as someone from a rural area, I very much appreciate all of your stats and the discussion of, and actually you had said this before at the table before the presentation started, talking about how there's such a discussion from the national level or even at the state level of, and different ideas of what rural looks like, yet there's such diversity amongst rural America throughout the United States. And so I guess my question is more how to bridge that urban versus rural divide, whether it's, say, every major election that happens nationally, it's like, let's have the national reporters come send in people like they're going to discover some extinct species in the Amazon as they send them out to rural America. Or even at the state level where you have policy discussions where so often legislators are thinking of urban cities and not thinking about how those policies would be enacted and implemented in a rural community. So how does one bridge that, whether that's at the state level or at the national level, so there's not this deep divide where people are wondering, how could this possibly happen? What are these rural people thinking? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really hard because there's two groups who really benefit from things being very divisive. And I don't mean this in any kind of judgmental way. One is the media, because it sells. You know, if people get really upset when they see something or like, oh, that's me, that causes clicks. It gets advertisement. And the other, unfortunately, I do think is politicians benefit from people being afraid or worried or building these kinds of things up. So things like elections really push on that kind of double weakness of our country. And, you know, obviously if there was a super easy answer, hopefully we would be using it or we'd be considering it. But I think the more everyday complexity we have for that, the less likely we are to fall prey to some, well, those are those people, those are those rural people. You know, one person who drives people in Eastern Kentucky crazy is J.D. Vance, because he's from Ohio, but he wrote Hillbilly Elegy about the occasional summers he spent in eastern Kentucky. And whether you love or hate his book, people where I'm from just don't think he represents our area and that he shouldn't be able to speak for it. Well, here's the problem. He's the only one who put the book out. That's our problem, not his. You know, that's comes back to, if you have seen that wonderful talk, The Power of the Single Story. So the more we get out stories of progressive rural communities, exciting rural communities, the harder it gets to sell a narrative that we're all like sitting around, I don't know, strumming banjos and hating everyone but ourselves, you know, whatever that story might be. And it's really hard to put your story out there because it makes you very vulnerable. Writing makes people vulnerable. Sharing makes people vulnerable, So I think the more we can practice this when we're young, then the easier it becomes to take those leaps where we do decide to engage in the conversation so that it isn't just some people putting the stories forth. Because again, that makes it very hard to reduce everybody when we have had those personal exchanges. And that's what the research, again, it comes back to research shows. What takes away stereotypes is when somebody has an interaction that defies that stereotype. Let us be the people defying the stereotype, extending the hand, putting that first step forward, letting it be known, hey, there's good, cool things going on in rural America. You know, we're reconnecting with the environment in these ways. We're caring about each other in these ways. We're building community in these ways. We're diverse in these ways. And the more we can embrace it and talk about it, the louder it's going to resonate in the broader community.
Thank you all so very much for your very thoughtful questions. I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Adams.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Sky Marietta for her wonderful presentation and inspiring remarks. I would like this time to thank the following individuals for without their assistance tonight would not have been possible. I would like to thank Ruth Brash from the Tommy Thompson Center and the Tommy Thompson Center for their generous sponsorship for tonight's event. I'd like to thank Jolene Werlin and Carrie Van Halgren from the College of Liberal Arts and Education Dean's Office. I would like to thank Dr. Lindsay Hollingsworth, Dr. Adina Hoslauer, Jessica Brogley, and Jenny McLean from the School of Education. I'd like to thank the local school partners for all they do, and most importantly, I would like to thank our students and alumni for the inspiring work that they do and will do in our rural communities. Thank you. It's awesome. This is going to be the talk of the town for our students tomorrow. It's going to be